The morning he left felt softer than it should have been, as if the world itself was trying not to wake him too suddenly from the life he was about to leave behind. Lucas stood beside his bicycle at the edge of a quiet street somewhere in the southern reaches of California, watching the pale gold light stretch slowly across the asphalt. The air was cool, not cold, and it carried that faint scent of dust and citrus that only existed in places where the desert politely shook hands with civilization. He adjusted the straps on his bags one last time, though he had already done so at least a dozen times before dawn, checking and rechecking like a ritual meant to calm the small storm inside his chest. There was no grand farewell, no crowd, no dramatic moment of departure. Just a man, a bicycle, and a distance that felt too large to understand all at once. 6,000 kilometers by bicycle, from the United States to Panama, was not something he could hold entirely in his mind, so he didn't try. Instead, he focused on the first turn of the pedals, the first stretch of road, the first hour of movement. He took a slow breath, mounted the bike, and began. The sound of the tires rolling over the pavement was steady and comforting, like a quiet rhythm that replaced thought with motion. Lucas had spent years in a life filled with noise, deadlines, and constant urgency, the kind of existence where days blurred into each other without leaving much behind. This journey was meant to be different. Not an escape exactly, but something closer to a reset, a long exhale stretched across countries and landscapes. As he pedaled forward, the town gradually thinned out, buildings giving way to wider spaces, and the road opened like a ribbon leading into something unknown but strangely welcoming. He didn't rush. There was no reason to rush anymore. The first hours passed with an almost meditative simplicity. His legs moved in a steady cadence, not fast, not slow, just consistent. The sun rose higher, warming his back, and the cool air softened into something gentler. Occasionally, a car would pass, the driver glancing briefly at him before continuing on. But for the most part, the road belonged to him. He began to notice small things, details that would have gone unseen in his previous life. The way the light shifted on the roadside plants, the distant hum of insects, the subtle changes in the texture of the road beneath his wheels. Each detail felt like a quiet invitation to be present. Around midday, he stopped near a small roadside diner, the kind of place that looked like it had existed unchanged for decades. He leaned his bicycle against a faded wooden railing and stepped inside. The air was cool and smelled faintly of coffee and something sweet. A woman behind the counter greeted him with a nod and a simple smile, as if travelers like him passed through every day. Even though he knew they probably didn't. He ordered a sandwich and coffee, sitting by the window where he could keep an eye on his bicycle. As he ate, he watched the road, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over him. There was no rush to leave, no pressure to check the time. The journey itself was the only schedule that mattered. When he stepped back outside, the sun had shifted slightly, and the shadows were shorter. He drank some water, adjusted his bags again out of habit, and continued on. The road began to rise gently, and the effort increased, but it was a welcome kind of effort, one that felt honest and direct. His body responded naturally, muscles working, breath deepening. Heart steady. There was something deeply reassuring about the simplicity of it all. Pedal, breathe, move forward. Nothing more was required. As the afternoon drifted toward evening, the light softened once again, turning everything into warmer shades of gold and amber. Lucas found a quiet place to stop for the night, a small clearing just off the road where the ground was flat and the view stretched out toward distant hills. He set up his tent slowly, unhurried, taking care with each movement as if the act itself was part of the journey rather than a task to complete. When everything was ready, he sat outside for a while, watching the sky change colors. The sounds of the day faded gradually, replaced by the gentle chorus of evening. Crickets began their steady rhythm, and a soft breeze moved through the grass. Lucas lay back, looking up at the first stars appearing in the deepening blue above. He felt tired, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that comes from honest effort rather than stress. His thoughts slowed, becoming quieter, less insistent. Somewhere in the distance, a car passed, its sound fading quickly into silence. The world around him felt vast but not overwhelming, quiet but not empty. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to his own breathing, steady and calm. This was only the beginning, just the first day of a journey that would carry him across borders and landscapes, through challenges and unexpected encounters. But for now, none of that mattered. There was only this moment, this quiet evening, this simple sense of being exactly where he was supposed to be. And as sleep slowly found him beneath the open sky, Lucas realized that perhaps the journey had already begun to change him, not in some dramatic or immediate way, but gently, like the gradual shift of light at dawn, almost unnoticed until you suddenly see the world differently. The second morning arrived quietly, as if the world had learned his pace overnight and chosen not to disturb it, and Lucas woke not to an alarm but to the soft brightness pressing gently against the fabric of his tent, a pale and patient light that asked nothing of him except awareness, and for a few moments he stayed where he was, listening to the faint sounds of the waking land, the distant whisper of wind brushing across dry grass, the occasional call of a bird somewhere unseen, and the steady rhythm of his own breath anchoring him in the present. And when he finally stepped outside, the air carried a cool clarity that felt almost new, like something borrowed from a quieter version of the world. And he stretched slowly, his muscles aware of yesterday's effort but not resisting it, instead holding a subtle memory of movement that made the idea of continuing feel natural rather than demanding, and as he packed his things with unhurried care, folding each piece of his temporary shelter into its place, he noticed how the simple repetition of these actions began to shape a kind of calm focus, a quiet ritual that replaced the scattered urgency he once lived with, and soon he was back on the road, the bicycle beneath him no longer unfamiliar but beginning to feel like an extension of his own body, responding to small shifts in balance and intention with a kind of silent understanding. The road stretched ahead in long, gentle lines, curving occasionally as if guiding rather than directing, and Lucas settled into a steady rhythm, his legs moving in a cadence that felt sustainable, almost effortless when he stopped thinking about it too much, and as the hours passed, the world unfolded in subtle variations rather than dramatic changes, the colors of the landscape shifting slightly, the texture of the air warming as the sun climbed higher, and the light itself becoming more defined, casting clearer shadows that moved alongside him like quiet companions, and he found that his thoughts no longer rushed to fill every moment, instead appearing slowly, dissolving just as easily, leaving behind a kind of spaciousness that he hadn't known he needed. And in that space, small observations became enough, the way the wind changed direction without warning, the faint scent of earth rising from a patch of darker soil, the distant outline of hills that seemed to remain just out of reach no matter how long he rode. At some point, he stopped checking the time entirely, the hours measured instead by the position of the sun and the gradual shifts in his own energy, and when he paused by the side of the road to drink water, he did so without urgency, letting the stillness settle fully before moving again, and it was during one of these pauses that he noticed how different silence felt out here. Not empty or uncomfortable, but full in a quiet and steady way, as if it held space for everything without demanding attention, and he realized that much of what he once called silence had actually been filled with subtle noise, the constant background hum of a busy life that he had stopped noticing until it was gone. By midday, the heat had begun to press more firmly against the land, softening the edges of distant shapes and slowing his pace slightly, but even this felt manageable, something to move with rather than against, and he found a shaded spot beneath a cluster of trees where he could rest, leaning his bicycle gently against the trunk as if acknowledging its quiet companionship. And as he sat there, eating a simple meal and watching the light filter through the leaves above, he felt a deepening sense of ease, not the kind that comes from comfort or convenience, but something more grounded, something that grew from being fully present in a moment without needing it to be different. When he resumed his journey, the afternoon unfolded with a kind of gentle repetition, the road rising and falling in small increments, the wind occasionally shifting to meet him head-on before easing again, and through it all, his body adapted without complaint, finding a balance between effort and rest that felt almost intuitive, and he began to understand that this journey was not about pushing himself to the limit, but about learning to move in harmony with the conditions around him, to listen more closely to what his body and the environment were telling him, and to respond with patience rather than force. As the day slowly leaned toward evening, the quality of light changed once more, becoming softer, more forgiving, and Lucas felt a quiet satisfaction settle within him, not because of any specific achievement, but simply from having moved forward, from having spent another day in this steady and deliberate way, and when he eventually chose a place to stop, a small open stretch of land with a wide view of the horizon, he did so with a growing confidence in his ability to find what he needed. To recognize the subtle signs of a good place to rest, and as he set up his tent once again, the actions felt even more familiar, the process smoother, more natural, as if the rhythm of this new life was beginning to take hold. He sat outside as the sky shifted through its evening colors, watching the horizon soften and the first stars appear, and there was a moment, brief but clear, when he realized that the distance ahead no longer felt overwhelming, not because it had changed, but because his way of approaching it had, and instead of seeing 6,000 kilometers as a single, impossible stretch, he saw only what was in front of him, the next curve in the road, the next hour of light, the next quiet breath, and that was enough. As darkness settled gently around him, Lucas lay down, his body tired in a way that invited rest rather than resisted it, and the sounds of the night rose softly, blending into a steady background that held him without distraction, and just before sleep took him, he felt a quiet certainty, not about where the road would lead or what he would encounter along the way, but about the simple fact that he could continue, one day at a time, one steady rhythm of movement after another, and that certainty, small and unspoken, was enough to carry him forward into whatever waited beyond the next sunrise. The third day began with a deeper stillness, the kind that comes not from silence alone but from familiarity slowly settling into the body, and Lucas noticed it the moment he opened his eyes, the absence of disorientation, the quiet recognition of where he was and what the day would ask of him, and as he stepped out into the cool morning air, there was a softness to everything that felt almost intentional, as if the world itself had slowed slightly to match his pace, and he moved through his routine with a calm precision, packing his tent, checking his bicycle, taking a few slow breaths before beginning again, and when he finally set off, the road seemed less like something to travel and more like something to follow. A gentle invitation rather than a demand. There was a subtle shift in the landscape as the morning unfolded, one that he might not have noticed before this journey, but now it stood out in quiet detail, the vegetation changing slightly, the air carrying a different scent, the colors of the earth deepening just enough to suggest that he was moving not just across distance but across invisible boundaries, and he realized that today he would cross into Mexico. A line drawn on maps and marked by signs and checkpoints, yet in reality far less abrupt than he had once imagined, and as he rode, he found himself wondering about these lines, how they shaped lives and identities while remaining invisible to the land itself. And the thought lingered gently without demanding an answer. By late morning, the road grew busier, a gradual increase in movement that signaled his approach to the border, and Lucas felt a faint tightening in his chest, not fear exactly, but a heightened awareness, the kind that comes when stepping into something unknown, and he slowed his pace slightly, allowing himself to take in the details, the signs in both English and Spanish, the subtle changes in architecture, the rhythm of the people moving through the space, and when he finally reached the crossing, it felt both ordinary and significant at the same time, a simple process of showing documents, answering a few questions. And then, almost without ceremony, passing from one country into another. On the other side, everything looked both familiar and different, the road continuing as it always had, yet the texture of the place shifting in ways that were difficult to define but easy to feel, and Lucas paused for a moment just beyond the crossing, standing beside his bicycle as he let the experience settle, and there was a quiet realization that the journey had expanded, not just in distance but in depth, that each new place would carry its own rhythm, its own subtle language of movement and interaction, and that he would need to learn to listen in new ways. As he continued, the sounds around him changed first. The cadence of voices, the distant music drifting from somewhere unseen, the hum of activity that felt more layered, more textured, and he noticed how these sounds blended with the steady rhythm of his own movement, creating a kind of harmony that grounded him even as everything around him shifted, and he found himself relaxing into it, allowing the unfamiliar to become simply part of the present moment rather than something to analyze or compare. The heat grew stronger as the day progressed, pressing more firmly against his skin, and he adjusted his pace accordingly, taking longer breaks, drinking more water, listening closely to what his body needed, and during one of these pauses, he stopped at a small roadside stand where a man sold fresh fruit, the colors bright and inviting under the midday sun, and though their conversation was limited by language, there was an ease in the exchange, a shared understanding carried through gestures and simple words, and as Lucas sat in the shade, eating slices of watermelon that tasted impossibly refreshing, he felt a quiet appreciation for these small moments of connection, brief and unspoken yet deeply grounding. When he returned to the road, the afternoon stretched out in long, warm hours, the landscape opening into wider spaces that seemed to breathe under the weight of the sun, and Lucas settled once again into his rhythm. The steady turning of the pedals, the rise and fall of his breath, the subtle adjustments that kept him moving forward without strain, and as he rode, he began to notice a change within himself, a growing trust in his ability to adapt, to move through unfamiliar places without needing to control every detail, and this trust brought with it a sense of calm that felt both new and deeply natural. As evening approached, the light softened once more, casting long shadows that stretched across the road like quiet markers of time passing, and Lucas found a place to stop near a small cluster of trees, the ground uneven but manageable, and as he set up his tent, the sounds of the surrounding area drifted toward him. Distant voices, the faint echo of music, the occasional passing vehicle, all blending into a background that felt alive but not intrusive, and when he finally sat down, watching the sky shift through its familiar colors, there was a sense that something subtle but important had changed. He was no longer just traveling through a landscape, but through layers of experience, through differences that did not separate but added depth, and as he lay back, looking up at the stars emerging one by one, he felt a quiet sense of continuity, the understanding that while borders might mark transitions, the journey itself remained unbroken, a steady thread of movement and awareness that carried him forward. And as sleep came to him once again, it did so gently, wrapping around the day's experiences without urgency, leaving behind only the soft certainty that tomorrow would bring another stretch of road, another set of quiet discoveries, and another step deeper into the unfolding rhythm of distance. The fourth morning arrived with a different kind of presence, heavier somehow, as if the air itself had thickened during the night, and Lucas noticed it immediately when he stepped out of his tent, the warmth already lingering despite the early hour, pressing gently but persistently against his skin, and he paused for a moment, taking a slow breath as he adjusted to the shift, understanding without needing to think about it that this day would ask something different of him, not more effort. Exactly, but a different kind of attention, a willingness to move more slowly, to listen more carefully, and to accept the pace that the environment would set rather than the one he might prefer. He packed his things with the same quiet rhythm that had begun to define his mornings, but there was a subtle change in his movements, a deliberate conservation of energy, each action measured, each motion purposeful without being rushed, and when he finally began to ride, the road felt different beneath him, not in its surface but in the way it responded to the heat, the air shimmering slightly in the distance, the horizon wavering just enough to remind him that what he saw was not always entirely solid, and as the sun rose higher, the warmth deepened into something more constant, wrapping around him like an invisible weight that he could not escape but could learn to move within. The rhythm he had found over the past days adjusted naturally, his pace slowing without resistance, his breathing deepening to match the effort, and he noticed how the simple act of paying attention became more important, the signals from his body clearer and more immediate, the need for water, for rest, for shade, all rising to the surface with a quiet urgency that could not be ignored, and instead of pushing through it, he responded, stopping more often, seeking out small patches of shadow, where he could sit for a few minutes and let his system settle, and in those pauses, the world seemed to hold still in a different way, the sound softened by the heat, the movement of distant things slowed. As if everything shared the same agreement to conserve energy. By midday, the sun stood high and unwavering, its presence absolute, and Lucas found himself drawn to a small roadside structure, little more than a simple shelter made of wood and corrugated metal, offering a rectangle of shade that felt almost sacred in its simplicity, and he leaned his bicycle against the side, stepping inside with a quiet sense of relief, the difference immediate and tangible, the absence of direct sunlight creating a space where he could breathe more easily, and he sat there for a long while, drinking water slowly, feeling it move through him, restoring something that the heat had begun to take. There was no rush to leave, and for once, he allowed himself to remain still without any sense of needing to continue, understanding that movement, too, had its proper time, and as he sat, he watched the light beyond the shelter, the way it pooled and shifted on the ground, the occasional figure passing in the distance, each one moving at a pace that reflected the same quiet negotiation with the day's conditions. And he realized that this was another lesson of the journey, not one of endurance alone, but of adaptation, of knowing when to move and when to rest, when to push forward and when to simply be still. When the sun began to lower slightly, its intensity easing just enough to make movement possible again. Lucas stood, stretching slowly, feeling the stiffness in his muscles but also the readiness returning, and he resumed his ride with a renewed sense of balance, no longer measuring his progress by distance or speed, but by the quality of his awareness, the steadiness of his breath, the ease with which he could remain present in each moment, and as he moved forward, the landscape unfolded in long, quiet stretches, the colors muted by the lingering heat, the air still carrying that dense warmth, but no longer overwhelming. The afternoon passed in a kind of suspended calm, the road stretching ahead without urgency, and Lucas found himself drifting into a deeper state of focus, where thoughts became less defined. More like impressions than words, and the simple repetition of pedaling became almost meditative, each turn of the wheel grounding him further in the present, and there was a sense, subtle but unmistakable, that he was beginning to align with the rhythm of the journey in a more complete way, no longer resisting the conditions but moving within them, allowing them to shape his experience rather than trying to control it. As evening approached, the heat finally began to release its hold, the air cooling gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, and then with increasing clarity, and Lucas felt the shift like a quiet reward, his body responding with a lightness that had been absent throughout the day. And when he found a place to stop, a slightly elevated patch of ground that caught the first hints of the evening breeze, he set up his tent with a sense of calm satisfaction, not from having covered a great distance, but from having moved through the day in a way that felt sustainable, respectful, and aware. He sat outside as the sky transitioned once more, the colors deepening, the light softening into shades that felt almost cool after the intensity of the sun, and the sounds of the evening returned gradually, insects beginning their steady chorus, the distant movement of life resuming its more familiar pace, and Lucas leaned back, letting his body rest fully, feeling the quiet fatigue settle into him. Not as a burden but as a signal that the day had been lived fully, in alignment with what it had asked of him. As darkness gently covered the land, he lay down, his breath slow and even, the memory of the heat already beginning to fade into something softer, something less immediate, and in its place remained a quiet understanding, that each day of the journey would carry its own challenges, its own conditions, and that the key was not to overcome them, but to move with them, to listen, to adapt, and to trust that in doing so, the path would continue to unfold in its own steady and reassuring way, and with that thought, simple and complete, he allowed himself to drift into sleep. Held gently by the cooling air and the quiet promise of another day ahead. The fifth morning came with a softness that felt earned, as if the previous day's heat had reshaped not only the land but also Lucas's way of moving through it, and when he opened his eyes, there was a quiet clarity in his mind, a sense that he no longer needed to anticipate the day in the same way, that whatever came would be met as it arrived, one moment at a time, and as he stepped out into the early light, the air carried a gentle coolness that lingered just long enough to feel like a quiet gift, and he stood there for a while, breathing it in, allowing his body to wake fully before beginning the now familiar rhythm of packing, each movement steady, each action simple, nothing extra, nothing missing. When he set off, the road greeted him with a calm openness, stretching forward through a landscape that seemed both vast and intimate at once, and as he pedaled, he noticed how his awareness had shifted again, becoming less focused on himself and more attuned to the subtle presence of everything around him, the distant shapes of buildings, the occasional movement of people, the quiet signs of life that appeared and disappeared along the edges of his path, and there was a sense that he was no longer separate from these things, but gently connected to them, part of the same slow unfolding of the day. By mid-morning, he reached a small town, the kind that seemed to exist in its own steady rhythm. Untouched by urgency, where the streets held a quiet familiarity and the buildings carried the marks of time without feeling worn, and as he rode through, he slowed naturally, taking in the details, the sound of voices drifting from open doorways, the scent of food being prepared somewhere nearby, the soft hum of daily life moving at a pace that felt almost aligned with his own, and without planning to. He found himself stopping near a modest cafe, its door open to the street, inviting without insistence. He leaned his bicycle against the wall and stepped inside, the transition from sunlight to shade creating a brief moment of stillness, and as his eyes adjusted, he was greeted by a quiet warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. A sense of welcome that existed without words, and he took a seat near the window, ordering something simple, and as he waited, he became aware of the gentle rhythm of the place, the way people moved, the soft exchanges between them, the unspoken understanding that seemed to hold everything together, and it was in this quiet observation that he began to feel a deeper sense of connection, not just to the journey, but to the people and places within it. When his food arrived, it was prepared with a kind of care that felt noticeable, even in its simplicity, and as he ate, he allowed himself to slow completely, to experience the moment without thinking about what came next, and at some point. The owner approached, a man with a calm presence and an easy smile, and though their conversation was limited, carried through a mix of simple words and gestures, there was an ease in the interaction that needed no translation, and when Lucas finished his meal and reached for his wallet, the man gently shook his head, refusing payment with a quiet insistence that felt both firm and kind. For a moment, Lucas hesitated, unsure how to respond, but the man simply smiled again, placing a hand briefly over his own chest before gesturing toward the road, as if to say that the journey itself was reason enough, and Lucas felt something shift inside him, a small but meaningful change, a recognition of the quiet generosity that existed in the world without expectation. And he nodded in gratitude, offering a simple thank you that felt insufficient but sincere, and as he stepped back outside, the light seemed slightly different, not brighter, but warmer in a way that extended beyond the physical. He resumed his ride with a renewed sense of calm, the encounter lingering in his thoughts not as something to analyze, but as something to carry, a quiet reminder that the journey was not only about distance or endurance, but also about these moments of connection that appeared without warning, and as the hours passed, he found himself moving with a lighter awareness, his body steady, his mind open, and the road unfolding with a gentle consistency that felt almost reassuring. The landscape shifted gradually as the afternoon progressed, the terrain becoming slightly more varied, the road rising and falling in longer, more noticeable waves, and Lucas adjusted without resistance, allowing his pace to match the changes, and there was a sense that he had begun to trust the process more fully, to understand that not every moment needed to be controlled or predicted, that there was value in simply responding to what was present, and this understanding brought with it a kind of ease that made even the more challenging stretches feel manageable. As evening approached, the air softened once again, the heat easing into something more balanced, and Lucas found a place to stop just beyond the town. A quiet area where the land opened into a wide view of the horizon, and as he set up his tent, the events of the day settled gently within him, not as memories to hold on to, but as part of a larger flow that continued to move forward, and when he sat outside, watching the sky shift through its familiar colors, there was a quiet gratitude that arose, not directed at anything specific, but present nonetheless. He lay back as the first stars appeared, his body relaxed, his breath steady, and in that moment, he felt a simple but profound understanding, that the journey was not something he was doing alone, even in its solitude, that there were unseen threads connecting him to the people and places he encountered. Small acts of kindness, brief exchanges, shared spaces, all forming a subtle network of support that carried him forward in ways he could not fully see, and as sleep slowly found him, that understanding remained, soft and steady, like the fading light of the day, guiding him quietly into rest and into whatever the next morning would bring. The sixth morning began in a way that felt unfamiliar after days of dry air and steady sun, with a faint shift in the atmosphere that Lucas noticed before he even opened his eyes, a softness in the light, a density in the air, and when he stepped outside his tent, the sky was covered in a gentle layer of gray, not heavy or threatening, but quiet and full, as if something was waiting just beyond the surface. And he stood there for a moment, sensing the change, feeling the subtle drop in temperature, the way the breeze carried a hint of moisture that hadn't been there before, and it brought with it a different kind of calm, one that asked for attentiveness in a new way. He packed his things as usual, though his movements held a slight hesitation, an awareness that the day might unfold differently, and when he began to ride, the road seemed to reflect the mood of the sky, muted, subdued, the colors less defined but somehow richer, and the air felt thicker as he moved through it, each breath carrying that faint promise of rain, and for a while, nothing happened, the world holding its balance in a quiet suspension, as if deciding whether to release what it held. Then, without urgency, it began, not with a sudden downpour but with a soft, steady drizzle, the kind that arrives almost unnoticed, small drops touching the ground with a quiet persistence, and Lucas felt them first on his arms, then on his face, cool and light, and he slowed slightly, adjusting his focus, his body responding instinctively, and though he could have stopped to put on additional layers, he chose instead to continue, allowing himself to move within the moment rather than step outside of it, and as the rain settled into a consistent rhythm, it created a new layer of sound, a gentle tapping that blended with the movement of his tires and the steady cadence of his breath. The road changed beneath him, its surface darkening, becoming smoother in appearance but more delicate in feel, and he rode with a heightened awareness, each movement more intentional, each shift in balance more precise, and there was something almost meditative in the way the rain transformed the experience. Narrowing his attention to the essentials, the feel of the handlebars in his hands, the rhythm of his legs, the pattern of drops landing and sliding away, and his thoughts grew quieter, not pushed aside but softened, as if the rain itself absorbed their edges. As the morning continued, the drizzle deepened slightly, still gentle but more present, and Lucas eventually found a small shelter by the side of the road, a simple overhang attached to an abandoned structure, and he pulled in, stepping out of the rain with a sense of calm rather than urgency, his clothes damp but not uncomfortable, and he leaned his bicycle against the wall, listening as the sound of the rain became more pronounced against the roof above, each drop contributing to a steady, almost hypnotic rhythm that filled the space without overwhelming it. He sat there for a while, watching the rain fall beyond the edge of the shelter, the world slightly blurred by the thin curtain of water, and there was a quiet beauty in it, the way everything seemed to slow, the way movement became softer, less defined, and he found himself breathing more deeply, his body relaxing into the stillness, the tension of movement replaced by a gentle rest, and in that moment, the journey felt less like a progression and more like a series of experiences, each one complete in itself, not needing to lead anywhere else. When the rain began to ease, shifting back into a lighter drizzle before gradually fading, Lucas stood, stretching slowly, feeling the stiffness that had settled during the pause, and he stepped back onto the road, the air now carrying a fresh clarity, the scent of the earth rising softly, and as he resumed his ride, everything felt slightly renewed, the colors returning with more depth, the landscape appearing sharper against the softened sky, and his own energy seemed to reflect this change, steady and grounded. The afternoon unfolded with a quiet consistency, the clouds remaining but thinning slightly, allowing diffused light to filter through, and Lucas rode with a calm focus, the earlier rain still present in the form of small puddles and damp patches that required attention but not concern. And there was a sense that the day had offered him something different, not a challenge to overcome, but an experience to move through, one that had shifted his awareness in subtle ways. As evening approached, the sky began to clear, the clouds parting just enough to reveal soft tones of light beneath them, and Lucas found a place to stop near a slightly elevated area where the ground had begun to dry, and as he set up his tent, the sounds of the day faded into the background, replaced by a gentle quiet that felt deeper after the steady presence of rain, and when he finally sat down, looking out at the horizon, there was a sense of balance, as if the day had completed itself in a way that required nothing more. He lay down as the first stars began to appear through the remaining gaps in the clouds, his body relaxed, his breath even, and the memory of the rain lingered not as discomfort, but as a soft echo, a reminder of the way the journey continued to change, to offer new rhythms and sensations, and as sleep came to him once again, it did so with a gentle certainty, carrying him forward into rest, into stillness, and into the quiet promise of whatever the next day would bring. The seventh morning arrived with a quiet clarity that felt almost anticipatory, as if the land itself was preparing to reveal something more demanding yet equally meaningful, and when Lucas stepped out into the early light, he noticed the change immediately, not in the air or the temperature, but in the shape of the horizon, where distant hills that had once seemed decorative now stood more defined, rising with a quiet insistence that suggested the road ahead would no longer remain gentle, and he stood still for a moment, taking in the view, not with concern but with a calm awareness, understanding that this, too, was part of the journey, another variation in the rhythm he had begun to trust. He packed his things with the same steady movements, though there was a subtle shift in his focus, a readiness for effort that felt grounded rather than tense, and when he began to ride, the change revealed itself gradually, the road tilting upward in long, almost imperceptible stretches at first, and Lucas adjusted instinctively, shifting his pace, finding a cadence that allowed him to conserve energy. And there was no urgency in his movement, only a quiet determination, a willingness to meet the road as it was rather than wishing it to be different. As the morning progressed, the incline became more pronounced, the gentle rise turning into a steady climb that required a deeper engagement of his body. And he felt it in his legs first, a slow build of effort that demanded attention, and then in his breath, which grew heavier but remained controlled, and he leaned slightly forward, his hands steady on the handlebars, his gaze fixed not on the distant peak but on the stretch of road just ahead, understanding now more than ever that the journey was not about conquering what lay far ahead, but about staying present with each small segment of effort. The landscape shifted alongside the climb, the vegetation becoming denser in places, the air cooling slightly as he gained elevation, and the sounds around him changed as well, the distant hum of the lower land fading, replaced by a quieter, more contained atmosphere, and there was a sense of moving into a different space, not just physically but internally, where focus narrowed and distractions fell away, leaving only the essential elements of movement, breath, and persistence. There were moments when the effort pressed more heavily against him, when his legs felt the strain and his breath deepened into something closer to exertion than ease, and in those moments, he did not resist, nor did he push beyond what felt sustainable, instead he slowed, sometimes even stepping off the bicycle to walk for a short stretch, allowing his body to recover without judgment, and there was a quiet acceptance in this. An understanding that progress did not always need to look like continuous motion. That stepping back or slowing down was not failure but part of the natural rhythm of moving forward. By midday, he reached a point where the climb offered a brief pause, a plateau that opened into a wider view of the land below, and Lucas stopped there, not out of exhaustion but out of a quiet recognition that the moment deserved attention, and he leaned his bicycle against a rock, stepping a few paces away to take in the view, the landscape stretching out beneath him in layers of color and light. The path he had traveled no longer visible in detail but present in its entirety, and there was a sense of perspective that came with this height, a gentle reminder of how far he had come without needing to measure it precisely. He sat there for a while, eating and drinking slowly, allowing his body to rest, and as he did, the effort of the climb began to settle into something softer, transforming from strain into a quiet sense of accomplishment, not in a dramatic way, but as a steady awareness that he had met the challenge in his own way, at his own pace, and that was enough. When he resumed his journey, the road continued upward, though with less intensity, the incline easing into a more manageable rhythm, and Lucas found himself moving with renewed steadiness, his body adapting once again, finding balance within the effort, and there was a sense that something within him had shifted, a deeper trust in his ability to navigate not just the easier stretches, but the more demanding ones as well. The afternoon carried him gradually toward the highest point of the day, and when he finally reached it, there was no dramatic marker, no sign to indicate the moment, only a subtle leveling of the road and a quiet opening of the horizon beyond, and Lucas recognized it not through sight alone but through the feeling in his body, the release of effort, the return of ease, and he allowed himself a small pause. A moment to acknowledge the transition before continuing. The descent that followed was gentle, not a rapid release but a gradual easing, the road sloping downward in long, smooth lines, and as he rode, the wind met him in a new way, cooler, carrying the scent of the land below, and his body relaxed into the motion, the effort of the climb giving way to a different kind of awareness, one that required attention but offered a sense of flow that felt almost effortless. As evening approached, Lucas found a place to stop near the base of the hills, the land opening once again into a wider, calmer space, and as he set up his tent, the experiences of the day settled within him, the effort, the pauses, the quiet moments of perspective, all blending into a single, continuous memory that did not need to be separated or analyzed, and when he sat outside, watching the sky soften into evening, there was a quiet satisfaction, not from reaching a destination, but from having moved through the day fully, with presence and patience. He lay down as the first stars appeared, his body carrying the memory of the climb but no longer holding its strain, and his breath moved slowly, evenly, and in that stillness, there was a quiet understanding, that the journey would continue to rise and fall, to offer ease and effort in equal measure, and that his role was not to control these changes, but to meet them, one moment at a time, with the same steady awareness that had carried him this far, and as sleep gently took him, that understanding remained, soft and constant, like the distant outline of the hills fading into the night. The eighth morning unfolded with a quiet spaciousness that felt different from the days before, as if the climb he had completed had opened not only the land but something within him, and when Lucas stepped out into the early light, the horizon stretched wide and uninterrupted, the hills now behind him, the road ahead extending in long, almost endless lines that seemed to dissolve into the distance, and for a moment he stood still, taking in the openness, feeling a subtle shift in his awareness. A sense that the journey had entered a new phase, one defined less by obstacles and more by endurance, by the quiet persistence of movement across vast and unbroken space. He began his morning routine with the same calm precision. Though there was an added ease in his movements, a familiarity that had settled fully into his body, and when he mounted his bicycle and set off, the road welcomed him with a gentle consistency, flat and steady, allowing his rhythm to establish itself quickly, and as he pedaled, there was a sense of flow that felt almost continuous, the absence of steep inclines or sudden changes creating a kind of seamless progression, where each moment blended softly into the next. The landscape carried a quiet beauty that revealed itself gradually, not through dramatic features but through subtle variations, the shifting tones of the earth, the occasional clusters of vegetation, the way the light moved across the open space, creating patterns that changed with each passing hour, and Lucas found himself drawn into this subtlety, his attention widening to take in the full expanse while remaining grounded in the steady rhythm of his movement, and there was a sense that he was no longer moving through the landscape, but with it, as if both he and the land were part of the same unfolding process. As the morning stretched into midday, the horizon began to play with his perception, appearing closer at times and then retreating just as he felt he was nearing it, and he noticed how this shifting distance mirrored something within him, the way goals and endpoints could feel tangible one moment and distant the next. And instead of chasing the illusion of arrival, he allowed his focus to remain on the present, on the feel of the road beneath him, the cadence of his breath, the steady turning of the wheels, and in doing so, the vastness around him became less overwhelming, transforming into a space of quiet continuity. There were long stretches where he encountered no one, the road empty except for his presence, and in that solitude, his thoughts drifted in a different way, not fragmented or urgent, but slow and expansive, rising and fading like the landscape itself, and he found a kind of comfort in this, a sense that he did not need constant interaction or distraction, that the simple act of being present within the movement was enough. And as he rode, the boundary between thinking and sensing seemed to blur, his awareness moving fluidly between the external world and his internal experience. By early afternoon, the heat returned, though less intense than before, and Lucas adjusted naturally, maintaining a steady pace, taking brief pauses when needed, and during one of these pauses, he stopped by the side of the road where a wide stretch of land opened into a view that felt almost infinite, and he stood there for a while, not seeking anything in particular, simply allowing himself to be part of the stillness. And there was a moment, subtle but clear, when he felt a deep sense of alignment, as if everything around him and within him had settled into a shared rhythm. When he resumed his ride, the afternoon unfolded with a quiet consistency, the light gradually softening, the shadows lengthening in long, gentle lines that moved alongside him, and the horizon, though still distant, began to feel less like something to reach and more like something to accompany him, a constant presence that shifted but never disappeared, and this realization brought with it a sense of ease. A release from the need to measure progress in fixed terms, allowing him instead to experience the journey as an ongoing flow. As evening approached, the sky opened into a wide display of color, unobstructed by hills or buildings, the fading light stretching across the vast space in soft gradients. And Lucas found a place to stop where the land remained open, the view uninterrupted in every direction, and as he set up his tent, the quiet of the place settled around him, deep and expansive, holding the day's movement within a calm stillness. He sat outside for a long time, watching the sky transition slowly, the colors deepening before giving way to the first stars, and there was a sense of being suspended between movement and rest, between the journey and the pause, and in that space, he felt a quiet understanding, that the horizon would always move, that distance would always shift, and that the true nature of the journey lay not in reaching a fixed point, but in the continuous act of moving, of being present within each moment as it unfolded. When he finally lay down, the vastness of the sky above him felt less overwhelming than it might have before, instead offering a kind of gentle reassurance, a reminder that he was part of something larger, something that did not need to be fully understood to be experienced, and as sleep slowly came, it carried with it the steady rhythm of the day, the quiet continuity of movement, and the soft certainty that tomorrow, the road would continue, the horizon would shift once again, and he would move forward, one calm and steady moment at a time. The 9th morning arrived with a subtle but undeniable change, one that Lucas felt before he could fully name it, a warmth in the air that was different from the dry heat he had known before, softer yet heavier, carrying a quiet humidity that settled gently on his skin, and when he stepped outside, the landscape itself seemed to reflect this shift, the colors deeper, the vegetation fuller, as if the land had begun to breathe in a slower, more abundant rhythm, and he stood for a moment, noticing how the air moved differently, how each breath felt richer, and there was a quiet understanding that he was nearing the edge of the tropics, a transition not marked by a single moment but by a gradual deepening of everything around him. He moved through his morning routine with the same calm familiarity, though his senses felt more alert, attuned to the subtle changes, and when he began to ride, the road carried him forward into this evolving landscape, the openness of the previous days giving way to areas where the greenery grew closer, the space narrowing just enough to create a sense of enclosure without feeling confined, and as he pedaled, the sounds around him shifted as well, the quiet hum of the open land replaced by a more layered chorus, insects, distant birds, the faint rustle of leaves moving in a breeze that felt warm and alive. The rhythm of his movement adjusted naturally, the humidity adding a new dimension to the effort. His breath deeper, his body working in a slightly different way, and he responded without resistance, slowing when needed, allowing his pace to match the conditions, and there was a sense that he had learned enough from the previous days to trust this process, to understand that each environment required its own way of moving, its own kind of attention, and that by listening closely, he could remain in balance. As the morning unfolded, he passed through small villages where life seemed to flow with a quiet steadiness, the buildings simple but full of character, the people moving with an ease that reflected a deep familiarity with the rhythm of the place, and Lucas felt a gentle connection to these spaces. Even as he moved through them briefly, acknowledging them with a nod or a quiet smile, and in return receiving the same, small gestures that carried a sense of shared presence without the need for words. The road itself began to change in texture, not dramatically, but enough to require a more attentive ride, occasional uneven patches, slight variations that kept him engaged with the immediate moment, and this engagement deepened his focus, bringing him fully into the experience of movement, where each adjustment of balance, each shift in weight, became part of a continuous conversation between himself and the path beneath him. By midday, the warmth had intensified, though it felt different from the harsh heat of earlier days. More enveloping than pressing, and Lucas found a shaded area near a cluster of trees where he could rest, the air beneath them cooler, the sounds of the surrounding life more pronounced, and he sat there for a long while, drinking water, allowing his body to settle, and as he did, he became aware of a deeper stillness within himself, not the absence of thought, but a kind of quiet harmony, where everything felt aligned, balanced, and complete in the present moment. When he returned to the road, the afternoon carried him further into this lush, evolving landscape, the greenery becoming more prominent, the air richer with scent and sound, and there was a sense that he was moving not just toward a destination, but into a different way of being, one that was more connected, more attuned to the subtle rhythms of the natural world. And as he rode, this awareness deepened, his movements becoming smoother, his attention more fluid, and the journey itself feeling less like a series of days and more like a continuous flow. As the light began to soften, the landscape took on a deeper richness, the colors warming under the gentle shift of evening, and Lucas found a place to stop near the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by trees that held the day's warmth within their stillness, and as he set up his tent, the sounds of the environment rose around him, a steady chorus that felt alive yet calming. And when he sat outside, watching the sky change through the gaps in the canopy, there was a quiet sense of arrival, not at a destination, but at a new phase of the journey. He lay back as the night settled in, the air warm and soft, the sounds of insects creating a continuous rhythm that replaced the silence of earlier nights, and in that moment, he felt a deep connection to the place, to the journey, to the steady unfolding of experience that had carried him this far, and there was a quiet understanding that Panama was no longer a distant idea, but something that existed within reach, not as a fixed endpoint, but as part of the same continuous path he had been following since the beginning. As sleep gently took him, the richness of the day remained, not as something to hold on to, but as a presence that blended seamlessly into the rhythm of rest, and within that rest, there was a quiet certainty, that the final stretch of the journey would carry its own lessons, its own moments of clarity and connection, and that he would meet them as he had met everything else, with patience, awareness, and the steady rhythm of forward motion. The 10th morning arrived with a quiet sense of completion that did not announce itself loudly, but instead settled gently into Lucas's awareness as he opened his eyes, the air warm and steady, the sounds of the surrounding landscape already alive with the rhythm he had come to know so well, and as he stepped outside, there was a subtle difference in how everything felt, not because the land had changed dramatically overnight, but because something within him had reached a point of quiet understanding, a recognition that the journey was no longer something ahead of him, but something he was already within, fully and completely. He moved through his final morning routine with the same calm care that had shaped each day. Though there was a softness to his movements, a lack of urgency that came not from fatigue but from a deep acceptance of the moment as it was, and when he mounted his bicycle and began to ride, the road seemed to welcome him in a familiar way, stretching forward through the rich landscape that now felt almost like a companion, something he understood without needing to analyze, and as he pedaled, the rhythm of his movement carried a quiet steadiness, unchanged yet somehow deeper, as if each turn of the wheels held the memory of every kilometer that had come before. The air grew heavier as the morning unfolded, the warmth increasing, the humidity wrapping gently around him, and the landscape thickened with life. The greenery more dense, the sounds more layered, and there was a sense that everything was moving towards something, not in a hurried way, but with a quiet inevitability, and Lucas felt it too, not as anticipation or excitement, but as a calm awareness that the journey was approaching a natural transition, a point where the road would no longer continue in the same way. As he rode, small signs of change began to appear, subtle at first, the occasional shift in the terrain, the presence of more people, the faint suggestion of a larger place ahead, and he allowed these details to unfold without rushing toward them, maintaining the steady pace that had carried him this far, and in doing so, he remained fully present, each moment complete in itself, not overshadowed by what was to come. By midday, the road began to lead him toward a wider, more open space, the trees parting slightly, the air carrying a different scent, one that felt both fresh and expansive, and as he continued, the sound reached him before the sight, a distant, steady presence that grew gradually louder, and when he finally saw it, the water stretching out before him, vast and calm, reflecting the sky in soft, shifting tones. He did not stop immediately, but slowed, allowing the moment to arrive fully. Without interruption. He came to a gentle halt at the edge, stepping off the bicycle with a quiet ease. And for a while, he simply stood there, looking out at the water, the surface moving slowly, almost imperceptibly, and there was a sense that the journey had not ended, but transformed, that the road had not disappeared, but continued in a different form, beyond what he could travel in the same way, and this realization settled into him with a calm clarity that required no further thought. He leaned his bicycle gently against a nearby post and walked a few steps closer, the ground soft beneath his feet, and as he stood at the water's edge, the sounds of the journey seemed to gather and fade at the same time, the rhythm of the wheels, the breath, the wind, the rain, all blending into a quiet memory that no longer needed to be held on to, because it had already become part of him. There was no dramatic emotion, no overwhelming sense of achievement, only a deep and steady calm, a recognition that the 6,000 kilometers had not been a path to a destination, but a gradual unfolding of presence, a movement through landscapes both external and internal, and as he stood there, the distinction between the two felt less important, less defined, as if everything had merged into a single, continuous experience. The afternoon light softened around him, the reflections on the water shifting gently, and Lucas sat down near the edge, his body at rest, his breath slow and even, and for the first time since the journey had begun. There was nothing ahead to prepare for, no distance to consider, no road to follow, and instead of feeling empty, the moment felt full, complete in a way that required nothing more. He remained there as the day moved quietly toward evening, the sky changing in slow, familiar tones, the sounds of the place settling into a calm rhythm, and as the first hints of night began to appear, he lay back on the ground, looking up at the sky, the vastness above mirroring the vastness of the water beside him, and there was a quiet symmetry in it, a sense that everything had come together in a way that did not need to be explained. As sleep approached, gently and without urgency, Lucas felt the same calm presence that had accompanied him since the first day. Now deeper, more settled, and he understood, in a way that was felt rather than spoken, that the journey had never truly been about reaching Panama, or completing a distance, but about learning to move with the world rather than against it, to listen, to adapt, to be present in each moment as it unfolded, and that this way of being did not end here, at the edge of the water, but would continue, quietly and steadily, wherever he went next. And as he closed his eyes beneath the soft night sky, the sound of the water moving gently beside him, the journey remained, not as something behind him, but as something within him, constant, calm, and endlessly unfolding.